This idea around office space not being able to be occupied, and then this discussion of the death of the office, there's a mental wear that takes on you.
Celebrating a century of success, where we've been, where we're going, and living the legacy focused on innovation, relationships, and doing the right thing. This is the More Than a Chair podcast by Business Furniture.
And it's my pleasure to welcome Matt Waggoner to the podcast, Managing Director at JLL and part of the Tenant Representation Advisory Team in the Indianapolis office, creating real estate strategies that allow businesses to attract and keep talent, and while growing their businesses as well. And really pleased to have you on this edition of the More Than a Chair podcast by Business Furniture, celebrating 100 years in business. I'm honored to host this series as we dive in and talk about aligning office space with company culture. Those are passions certainly for both JLL and Business Furniture. And Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Gerry.
Hey, before we get into kind of the heart of our discussion, I want to learn a little bit more about you and your journey in the real estate business. You're a Hoosier native from Mishawaka, Northern Indiana, came down to Butler, and that kind of launched you in this career path.
I didn't know anything about commercial real estate when I was at Butler and had the opportunity to intern with a local commercial real estate firm. Came on completely ignorant in 2007 to what was happening in the world, the environment around us, and turns out there was a great recession that was about to hit us. So very interesting time to learn the business, but I'm appreciative of that entire experience. So in that period of time, most of our client base was making decisions solely based on financial savings opportunities because of the uncertainty in the economic environment. Kind of fast forward to 2013, I found my passion for the business around this idea that people spend more waking hours in their workplace than anywhere else in life. And just this idea that we could impact or influence the way that employers thought about that in a more thoughtful way and not just viewed office space as a commodity was something that got us excited to do what we do. So then you take that and fast forward to the next chapter of March 2020, and everybody goes home. Office spaces are not occupied, and everybody's talking about the death of the office.
Did those early days help a little bit maybe in dealing with the adversity that you've been through the last couple of years?
Coming into the pandemic, a lot of folks talked about the predictions of what they thought the pandemic might bear. They were almost 100% wrong on almost all fronts on that side. This idea around office space not being able to be occupied, and then this discussion of the death of the office, there's a mental wear that takes on you for so long. And you have friends reaching out and saying, hey, are you thinking about jumping ship, switching industries? And we've always found opportunity in whatever we've done to help clients navigate challenging periods. I think one rosy colored picture that we took early on in the pandemic was at no point in time in the history of the working world have more organizations and more business leaders been forced to think about their office space strategy at any one point in time. So out of that challenge and out of the tough situation they were navigating, we found an opportunity to help them.
You mentioned that phrase, death of the office. We've heard a lot about these last couple of years. Any validity to that? Where do you see? Because I talk to CEOs and others on both sides of the coin, CEOs and HR people who say we've got to have that face-to-face contact. So the office is always going to be there. Others are looking at some 100% remote, some hybrid, all these different options. What are you hearing and seeing?
So we've seen at a macro level that there's been winners and losers of this entire pandemic, and as it relates to cities or office space, office buildings in general. At a city level, you saw a lot of net exporting of talent and companies from states like California who were challenged from some of the environment there. Downtowns of major metro areas, you saw a lot of flight out of those initially, again, because of these barriers to getting folks back. Cities like Phoenix, Austin, Tampa, Orlando, Nashville have been winners in this entire scenario. I think a lot of that's the environment they live in. As it relates to the actual office piece of it, I think a lot of it's driven on the employee base. At the end of the day, the clients that we work with, people are their biggest asset. It's not a manufacturing system. It's not product. It's generally speaking people. And so they're going to have to be forced to talk to what do my people want and need. Early on, I think there was an overextension of people listening to the employees at a micro level, and the employees saying, we love working at home. I love walking my dog. I love doing my laundry. I love all the convenience of these things and not having to commute. That was magnified in bigger cities like a Chicago or New York, where you have an hour to an hour and a half commute each way. That's 3 hours of time. That makes a lot of sense. Indianapolis doesn't have those macro challenges from a city perspective. I think as time has gone on, you've seen employers start to challenge that a little bit and say, okay, we understand that There's things that you like about it, but how can we mix that with also achieving our strategic business objectives, which are bigger than your individual list of to-dos in a given day?
What are you hearing specifically here in Indianapolis and perhaps more broadly around Indiana from CEOs and HR people, decision makers, in terms of their outlook on space? Is there a consensus at all, or is it kind of all over the map on where companies are going when it comes to office space?
I think the big piece that we're seeing that is consistent is around this idea of choice. Almost across the board, there are very few companies that are saying you have to be in the office 5 days a week in order to work here. I would say anecdotally what we've seen is kind of that 3 day per week is where things seem to be shaking out. But recognizing that there are benefits from this environment of work from home, and there are benefits to having the ability to pick a child up from a school activity or just have a day to do heads down work because it's less disruptive than being in the office. I don't think it looks negatively upon relative to what we've learned coming out of that. So I think the big consistency is that it's not a one size fits all. It's also not everybody in the office. We're seeing very few companies that are everybody from home, but a lot that are in between. And hybrid's a very vague term. It's basically anything except all in the office or all work from home.
Yeah, we'll talk about that because I want to ask you about the hybrid model and how prevalent that will be as part of the future of office.
So the big piece that impacts your actual real estate footprint is this idea of 3 days a week. So if you're in 3 days a week or more, that means that you have overlap where all the employee base could be in at one time, which means you can't really dramatically reduce the number of seats you have, which means your footprint's generally staying in the same size range. I think coming to that realization for companies helped kind of relieve the pressure that they felt to dramatically reduce the footprint if they're going to let people work from home. We've seen a lot of organizations say our focus is on productivity, driving business outcomes, and getting talent right now. Very few say it's cutting real estate costs. They just felt this, kind of external pressure to do that if people are working from home. So as it relates to actually impacting the real estate footprints, most organizations are maybe reducing a little bit, but really focusing on the highly amenitized areas of town or the areas that have this live, work, play environment because they want to create a magnetic effect for their employees to come in versus saying this is what our mandatory charge is for you. Mm-hmm. We've seen a lot of companies shift away, and we encourage them to shift away from this idea of saying you have to work in the office these days, these few days a week, that sort of thing, and really draw it more towards, we've asked you your opinions, you shared what you like about being in the office, what the office is used for, we're going to create that and give it to you, almost like office as an amenity. Downtown
Indianapolis for many years has been such a nationally recognized success story, and office is certainly a piece of that, but also the retail component, the sports and convention business, the vibrancy that existed in downtown Indianapolis, which was very tangible, very real before the pandemic. It's changed. There's no question about it. As you look at downtown specifically when it comes to office in relation to those other elements, retail, sports and tourism, the safety issue, all those issues come into play. What's your assessment right now when it comes to downtown Indy?
We had such amazing momentum, and I have peers, I have friends, we have national recognition from the Super Bowl and all these major sports events we've hosted of how great downtown Indianapolis is. It's safe, it's walkable, it's very friendly. That's kind of our environment. The pandemic certainly has had its impacts on downtown in a granular way, and I would say the biggest issue is downtown has been slower to recover or slower to get back to the density that allowed it to be safe, allowed it to be walkable, allowed retail to flourish. My own opinion is we certainly have our challenges long term, but I don't think it's as dire as some of these larger, cities that have an even bigger downtown and more barriers to get downtown. If anything, some of the idea that you don't have to be downtown 5 days a week might benefit because now you're not trying to convince employees they have to commute 5 days a week. Maybe it's 2 or 3 days. The thing that they're still going to resolve around is that you need to give them something that they're excited to come down to. Mm-hmm. So they're not excited to come downtown when there's nobody on the streets, that there's, crime, there's homelessness that are very prevalent when you're walking down. It gives an employee the unsafe kind of feeling.
Circle Center, future uses. A lot of people from the Chamber and other Visit Indy organizations are really focused on trying to come up with ideas for what that becomes, and the impact obviously extends in many ways in a big way about the future of downtown. People have talked about is office a possibility in terms of a future reuse for Circle Center?
The one thing I can say firmly is office is not the best use for that building for a lot of reasons, but the depth of footprint makes it hard to have natural light come in, and that's one of the most important things for office space. There are certain elements of it. The old Carson Perry Scott space actually would be good office space being marketed for office space now. I think we're going to see a big draw towards experiences. We've seen that. We're going to continue to see that versus product purchases. So I think some experiential element of being able to walk downtown and see something that you can walk into and that experience could be a good future use for the space.
Yeah. Culture is certainly a word that has been in the office environment for a long time, pre-pandemic. Has the importance of culture in office space, is it amplified now during and now coming out of the pandemic?
The before pandemic realities where they would have ping pong tables, kegs, kind of these superficial cultural parts and pieces to the space that I don't think were actually truly creating culture. Maybe they just kind of signify that when you walk through. I think coming out of the pandemic, you had this period of time where everybody was at home and isolated, for lack of a better word, not interacting with employees except for virtual. We heard a lot of organizations talk about a virtual burnout, where they said, we're just sick of being on calls. We're sick of video, face. We just want to have that casual conversation that we bump into somebody with. The office, again, doesn't have to be everything to everyone anymore. So I think the real use of office going forward for a lot of organizations, certainly not all of them, is to create that hub of employee connectivity, brand outflow or recognition for the company, and then also community connectivity. I think a lot of people don't realize, I was in Phoenix, there's some major corporations that are centered right in the area of Tempe, Arizona. That's a very integral part of that whole community. It's not just the employees or the employer, but it's the whole community that they're supporting by bringing people there.
Can that happen here in Indianapolis?
Absolutely. I think it takes business leaders in our community. You start with some of our biggest employers. We talked about Eli Lilly coming back to the office. That's a major, major signal to saying we're back in the downtown community. And I think what a lot of the employers that are maybe a smaller size than the Anthems and the Rolls-Royce and the Eli Lilly, they're looking to some of those companies and saying, what are they doing? So they can lead in that example of bringing people back downtown. And the reality is, let's remember the good parts about it. Let's reflect on what we've learned. Let's understand that it doesn't have to be a 5-day-a-week situation, but it can certainly be a great benefit to be downtown.
Yeah, one other question on culture too, and that's the importance of space, of office space in that culture equation. Obviously, it's very critical. How so? Can you talk about a little bit about how space in an office is so essential when it comes to creating a great culture?
From an employer's perspective, I think the removal of space from your workplace equation really equates to the employees basically looking at their job and saying, do I like what I do and am I paid enough? And if not, I'm just going to go find something else to do because I can be at home and I can do everything. So I think from the employer's perspective, there's a very big risk to not having the employees connected to one another. I think space can be one element to help them connect to one another. Certainly there are other ways. And then from the employee's perspective, again, my opinion, but we're human beings. We're not computer beings. We're not virtual beings. We're human beings. And so desiring that connectivity, those relationships that come and are formed in work. And again, that's not necessarily 5 days a week is the requirement to do it. I think that's the biggest shift here is that there's benefits the office can provide the employee base to connect, to have innovation. Another huge one is mentorship and development. I can look back at my early stages of my career and just overhearing conversations that happened or sitting in the room with a senior advisor and just listening to the conversations they had helped me grow tremendously. And I think there's a huge risk to development, especially some of these professional service organizations like a JLL or accounting firms, law firms, by not being together and being able to have those kind of casual collisions that happen throughout the day.
Talent is such a huge issue here in Indiana, really all over the country, obviously. I think if you ask Governor Holcomb and the folks at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation what the biggest challenges are for the state, you'd put talent, attracting and keeping certainly at or near the top of the list. When you look at space, office space, and specifically that issue, how does that relate directly to talent and talent attraction?
Several firms that we've worked with have had the perspective of we're concerned about taking a position that's pro-office for fear that we will have people leave who want to work from home or we won't be able to recruit people. I think the most important thing as it relates to the employer's role in this is having a very clear conviction about what their stance is. And that stance, again, there's a wide spectrum of stances on that. It doesn't have to be all in the office, doesn't have to be all work from home, could be somewhere in between. But I think the vague nature of that can lead to employees not understanding what's expected of them and therefore turnover and therefore them leaving. So I think, again, the benefit that space can have as it relates to that discussion is this idea that I'm going to be developed here, I'm going to connect with other fellow employees here, but I also don't have to be here every day of the week. And I think for a lot of our clients in Central Indiana, they've had the opportunity to recruit out of state. because they have remote positions open. That's a tremendous opportunity. It doesn't obviously necessarily help tax paying situations here, but it helps our employers still grow their business and flourish in that regard.
I was going to ask you about that, and that's remote, the remote workforce, which is coming into focus more than ever coming out of the pandemic here. Do you see that as an opportunity for companies in Indiana, and if so, how? And how does technology and space, do those things come into play in any way in that arena?
Yeah, it's a tremendous opportunity for employers. I think from a tax payer base, you're going to see more of those remote workers live in Colorado and Phoenix, and we're on Big Sky, Montana, and their net increase in residents has never been higher, because they can live there and there's not many employers there, but they can work anywhere. So I think it does present an opportunity to grow the workforce. If we have a constrained talent pool here in front of us, and again, as you mentioned, it's a national issue. It's not an Indiana issue solely. But if we have that here, it allows them to go outside of that so they can continue to grow their business without just looking around and not having folks to bring in.
When you look back and kind of add on to some of your earlier comments when it comes to downtown Indianapolis, in your conversations with business leaders and decision makers, what's your feeling in terms of their outlook on the future of downtown Indy when it comes to work, office space, and the future here in downtown Indy?
Our message to them is don't make a knee-jerk decision right now, because again, we are just now getting back to the point where we're going to have folks returning to the office or coming back in a meaningful way. We tried a little bit in 2021 and then Delta came along. So I think our message has been don't make a knee-jerk reaction as it relates to your downtown presence or what that looks like going forward. I think that candidly there's a lot of concern and skepticism. And again, I think folks are kind of looking around to one another saying, who's coming back? Again, downtown thrives when there's this ecosystem or environment of density and many businesses being there. So I think the next 24 months will be very, very critical for downtown to see who comes back downtown, who returns to the office in a meaningful way. Salesforce, a massive employer downtown, also brings a lot of talent that spends money at lunch spots, at retail spots, that connects for drinks after work. Seeing how those companies come back downtown versus just talking about it, because that's all we've been able to do for the last 2 years is talk and speculate.
Right.
The speculation period's over.
Yeah.
So now it's the next 12 to 24 months.
So there's a psychological piece to this, and you mentioned Lilly earlier, just the fact that Eli Lilly and Company, this iconic large employer in downtown Indianapolis, is back, sends a signal that perhaps will impact other companies.
Absolutely. Certainly the bigger the company, the more structures and thoughtfulness needs to go into making a decision like that. So I think when you see what we would say are maybe the slower moving, larger organizations start to make that move forward, it empowers others to do the same.
Probably an unfair question, but is there one thing or maybe one or two things that you have learned coming out of the pandemic, learning from the pandemic, that are noteworthy, especially as you look to the future when it comes to office space? For
a lot of organizations, they previously used, we call it real estate as a reward. So this idea that as you progress in your career, you get a bigger individual workspace in your office, which creates a lot of real estate challenges. You're constantly growing. We work with some organizations who have plenty of open workstations, but they don't have those 3 partner offices they need to promote somebody. So they have to take more space even though they have a lot of vacancy. Creates a lot of challenge and confusion as it relates to your clear-cut real estate strategy. I think creating a more uniform, decoupling the hierarchical nature of real estate as it relates to inside the office space is a tremendous opportunity for companies. It also helps companies grow their people because they can assign 2 people for every 1 seat or 1.5 people for every 1 seat and not have to expand as their business continues to grow.
Yeah, I'm sure you would say that the importance, the relevance of a JLL, of a business furniture has always been there. But in some ways, as you look at the decisions that companies are making and needing to make and will make over the next 24 months, is the importance of your company, of a BFC, even more important than before because of these kinds of decisions that companies are faced with?
Absolutely. Before the pandemic, again, we'll reference, there's a lot of move towards open office space, or there are a lot of these kind of trends. And what happened was you heard a lot of companies talk about what FANG, as a term that we use, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google. What does FANG do? And let's follow that. We've always thought that was a horrible strategy because that doesn't take into account your employee base and what their wants and needs are. So this dynamic existed before COVID. I think it's been amplified now. And again, we had actually a business line that was created or really amplified in COVID that's all around workplace planning and strategy. And the whole idea around that is listen to your people, your employee base, listen to your leaders, and then understand what they like about working remotely, what they like about being in the office, and then create a clear strategy and path towards trying that out. And we've oftentimes said trials over outcomes. So this idea that rather than taking your whole organization and making this huge change, why don't you take a chunk of your space or a department or whatever it is and try something over the next year? The reality is nobody knows.
Yeah.
Nobody knows how this is going to play out.
Yeah.
We're still somewhat kind of on the tail end of even the pandemic. So it's hard to know exactly what the right mix is. And there's clearly not a one size fits all. There never has been.
Yeah. So you've clearly created a business unit coming out of the pandemic. Any surprises or things you've learned in that process?
We were surprised at how big of a challenge this is for really successful companies. Again, I think there's just so many unknowns. There's a lot of noise. There's external noise from media, news outlets of just mixed messaging throughout the pandemic around the office space. And then the internal noise of hearing, we usually say that there's loud barkers in an organization, and those loud barkers are saying, we have to work from home. This is the greatest environment, that sort of thing. So I think helping separate from the noise and say, okay, let's work through an intentional process that seeks our people's feedback in a formulaic way, and then create a path based on that. It's not overly complex, but it's very, very important to include the people, let them know they were included, communicate to them, and then create a path that's based on their feedback.
So I'm sensing that you're fairly bullish on Office going forward. It's going to be different, and nobody knows perhaps exactly how, but in terms of the future of Office, the importance of Office, you're bullish on that whole concept.
As we talked about winners and losers kind of on the national scale, I think let's just dial it down to Indianapolis. I think there's major winners. Those will be the office developments that are in a highly amenitized area that are easily accessible. You think BottleWorks, Midtown Carmel's has a 0% vacancy rate right now. So, I mean, these areas where somebody will come to, they'll walk to have lunch, they'll meet a friend after work, they'll drop their dry cleaning off, whatever it is, that those areas that give the employees more when they arrive is so important. We had one client who moved from a suburban office park on the northwest side to Midtown Carmel, and in asking her, she's the CEO of the company, and asking her, 6 months after how the move's been, how the employees like the new space, her response was, "I'm actually pretty annoyed at how much more they like it."
Oh, really?
She got,
Right.
I didn't ever think that office space had that big of an impact, and our space was cool in this suburban office park. The reality was there was so much more that they could unlock, and
Right.
she's like, now what I thought was, plenty of space, I'm not sure is enough because people actually want to come back. The parks that will be challenged are the run-of-the-mill suburban office parks or the downtown buildings that have not been updated and have not been brought forward to this environment that people want to show up and work in.
Yeah.
And that has to do with amenities, has to do with walkable area. Office space as a commodity is going to be strongly challenged, because people have proven they can do work from home. So the question is if it's just a place for me to show up and the environment's horrible, I don't like what I do, I'm probably going to, especially in this employment environment, I'm going to find somewhere else to work. And so I think that the losers or the ones that'll be more challenged are these very static suburban office parks that have just kind of been the low cost provider. When you contrast the cost of talent versus the cost of real estate, the cost of talent for our clients are usually 15 to 20 times more than the real estate. So if you save, a few bucks on real estate, that is de minimis to losing an employee.
Yeah, interesting. Are you seeing these live, work, play environments, BottleWorks, 16 Tech, you look in Fort Wayne, Electric Works, popping up all over the place? Those are the kinds of projects that are really attracting and helping to be kind of a magnet for office.
Absolutely. BottleWorks, now is working on their future office developments. One of the groups that's just committed to the space is Lumina Foundation, a client of ours. We've been working with them on a multi-year process to help determine that. And that building won't be built until early 2024. So you're seeing firms look 2 to 3 years out to make these decisions because they want something to tell their employee base, this is where we're going. Even if it's not tomorrow or even next year, we're making a commitment to an area that provides you with more. And I think that's the major message here is how can we give the employees more and not just respond to their individual feedback about how work from home is and that sort of thing, because that will vary based on the employee and your employees change over time as you grow. So I think they're trying to get the themes from the employee base and then act based upon that. And the biggest themes are, we want an area where we can do more and experience more if we're going to come there.
And again, back to that talent issue, these live, work, play environments are what what's going to attract talent. The 16 Tech people, they would just say this is a talent play. This development. It's about life sciences and those types of things, but it's about getting people there.
Without a doubt. The big organizations that were in a very traditional building tower that are trying to draw their people back are challenged. Mm-hmm. The ones who have moved towards that newer environment that are saying, we're giving you a lot more when you get here, I think will flourish.
Matt Waggoner is a managing director at JLL, also part of the tenant representation advisory team in the Indianapolis office. Matt, it has been a real treat to have you on the podcast this week. Some great perspective on the office environment, not only present, but future, and that's very critical for Indianapolis. So, Matt, thanks very much.
The office isn't dead, Gary. Thanks for having me.
There you go. Great parting shot there. Very good. And thank you for joining us on this edition of the More Than a Chair podcast by Business Furniture, celebrating 100 years in business. I'm Gerry Dick. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.